There was a place you could pull into on a summer night with the windows down and the radio on. You would park under a tin canopy, flash your headlights, and a teenager on roller skates would glide up to your window with a tray full of burgers and a mug of root beer so cold there was frost on the outside of the glass. That place was A&W. At its peak, franchise records show 2,400 locations across the United States. One of the largest fast food chains in the country. The oldest franchised restaurant system in America. And in March of 2002, a corporation called Tricon Global Restaurants paid $320 million for it. They renamed themselves YM Brands, and they had a plan for A&W. What they did to it is what happens when a brand gets bought by people who understand the numbers, but not the product. And by the time they were done, they handed you a paper cup. The year was 1919. Roy Allen set up a root beer stand in Lodi, California, during a homecoming parade for soldiers returning from World War I. He sold frosty mugs for a nickel apiece. Prohibition was months away. Every bar in America was about to shut down. And here was a drink with the word beer in its name that was perfectly legal. Allen set up his stand like a bar, a wooden counter, and a footrail, and men lined up drinking root beer out of heavy glass mugs like it was the real thing. Root beer had a bite. It had foam. It had the word beer in its name, and on a hot California night with every saloon about to go dark, that meant something. Allen had found the right product at exactly the right moment. He opened a second stand in Stockton. In 1922, one of his employees, a man named Frank Wright, became his partner. They combined their initials, A for Allen, W for Wright. The name A&W was born. In 1925, Allen started selling franchises. You paid a small fee, bought Allen's root beer concentrate, and hung the A&W sign out front. There was no standard menu and no standard building. The only thing every location shared was the root beer. It was one of the first restaurant franchise systems in America, years before McDonald's or Dairy Queen had built anything like it. In 1924, Allen had bought out Wright's share. Frank Wright sold his stake and moved on, but his initials stayed on every sign. 2 years after Allen began selling franchises, something happened that belongs in a different kind of story. In May of 1927, a young man named J. Willard Marriott and his wife Alice opened a 9-seat A&W root beer stand at 604 14th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. $3,000 to get started. $1,000 of that went to the franchise rights covering Washington, Baltimore, and Richmond. That stand became Hot Shops. Hot Shops became the foundation of Marriott Hotels. One of the largest hotel companies on earth grew out of a 9-seat root beer stand and $3,000. That tells you what kind of brand A&W was in those early days. By 1974, the chain had grown to roughly 2,400 locations across the United States. By the post-war years, the classic A&W experience had taken full shape. You pulled in and found your spot under a metal canopy. Each parking space had a speaker box on a pole. You would roll your window down, push the button, and give your order to a crackling voice. Then you waited. The waiting was part of it. While you waited, you looked around. Who else was here tonight? Who was in the blue Chevy 3 spots down? The whole parking lot was a stage. Every car was a front row seat. Then the car hop came. Usually a girl, 16 or 17, roller skates making a sound on the pavement you could hear from 3 rows away. She carried a chrome tray loaded with food and hooked it right onto the outside of your driver's side window. It hung there like it was the most natural thing in the world. On a Saturday night in summer, the big A&W locations had 4 or 5 car hops working non-stop from 6 in the evening until 3 in the morning. The root beer came in a glass mug that had been sitting in a freezer until the moment they filled it. The glass was so cold it had frost crystals clinging to the outside. When they poured the root beer in, It foamed up thick and dark and sweet. You could smell it before it reached your lips. Nothing in a can or a bottle has ever come close to what root beer tasted like out of a frosty A&W mug on a hot night in July. The menu was built around a family. Papa Burger for the big one. Mama Burger in the middle. Teen Burger, Baby Burger for the little ones, small enough for tiny hands. Coney dogs split down the middle with chili and onions running over the sides. Onion rings in a paper boat, still too hot to eat, grease soaking through the bottom. Root beer floats, a scoop of vanilla dropped into a frosted mug, ice cream rising to the surface, root beer fizzing around it. You ate it with a long spoon and drank the rest through a straw. At the end of the night, you slid that mug under the seat and drove away. Everybody did it. There are grown men in their 70s right now with a stolen A&W mug in their kitchen cabinet they've had since 1963. You can find people online sheepishly admitting the same thing. Their fathers did it too. One man wrote that his dad had the full set. Baby, mama, papa, grandpa, stolen over the course of a decade. A&W knew it was happening. They couldn't stop it. Those mugs were probably the most shoplifted item in the history of American restaurants, and everybody loved every single one of them. But something was already breaking underneath all of it, and nobody in charge of A&W wanted to see it. Here's the thing nobody told you when the A&W near you closed. Competition didn't kill it. Changing tastes didn't kill it. It was a structural crack that had been there since the beginning. And then a string of people bought the company and made it worse. The crack was this: there was no standard menu at A&W until 1978. 59 years of business, 2,400 locations, and no two of them had to serve the same food. One might have fried chicken, another had tacos, another had nothing but hot dogs and root beer. No consistency, no quality control, no common identity beyond the sign and the concentrate. Nobody running the company had ever forced an answer to the most basic question in franchising: what are we actually selling? Franchisees liked it that way. They were independent operators who'd built their A&W stands from nothing, run them for 20 to 25 years, and built their whole lives around them. And then, in the 1960s, A&W changed hands. A company called Hungerford Smith owned the root beer brand. In 1966, United Fruit Company bought it. United Fruit, the same company that had spent decades running banana plantations across Central America, negotiating with governments and enforcing contracts across thousands of miles of supply chain. They were experts at one thing: squeezing every dime out of what they'd bought. Now they owned your root beer stand. What Roy Allen had built wasn't a food chain, it was a ritual. People didn't go to A&W because they were hungry. They went because it was the place you went. United Fruit saw a root beer concentrate operation. They missed the 60 million memories attached to it. The company that absorbed them, first AMK Corporation and then United Brands by 1970, began converting drive-ins to walk-up windows wherever they could, cutting the carhops service that had been the whole point. Then came the franchise renegotiation, new royalty payments, new terms. Franchisees who'd been running their A&W stands for 20 to 25 years looked at those new contracts and refused to sign. Why would they? They'd built the thing. They'd been promised a deal. Now someone in a boardroom they'd never visited wanted a percentage they hadn't agreed to. One by one, the original operators walked away or were forced out through lawsuits. By 1980, A&W had dropped from 2,400 locations to 1,300. The biggest drive-in chain in American history had cut itself in half in less than 15 years. 8 different owners in 50 years. Nobody stayed long enough to understand what they had. And then came the math test. In the early 1980s, real estate developer Alfred Taubman bought A&W. He thought the chain had a shot at challenging McDonald's directly. McDonald's Quarter Pounder had 4 ounces of beef and was a national institution. Taubman's team came up with a 1/3 pound burger for the same price. In blind taste tests, the A&W burger beat the Quarter Pounder. Taubman backed it with a big television and radio campaign and called it "Third is the Word." It was a complete flop. Nobody bought it. Taubman brought in a market research firm to find out why. They ran focus groups across the country. The results came back, and Taubman later wrote that he could not believe what he was reading. Many of the people in those focus groups thought a third of a pound was smaller than a quarter of a pound, because 3 is less than 4. They concluded 1/4 had to be more meat than 1/3. Some actually complained that A&W was trying to charge the same price for less beef. Taubman wrote about it in his book, Threshold Resistance. The New York Times later cited it as a case of consumer arithmetic failure. A&W quietly renamed the burger the Papa Burger and moved on. Decades later, in 2021, the company leaned into the story and launched a burger listed as 3/9 of a pound. 3/9 of a pound is exactly 1/3, but 9 is bigger than 4. The joke landed because the original failure still stung 40 years later. The fractions fiasco did not kill A&W, but the ownership carousel kept spinning. It was bought by Sagittarius Acquisitions in 1994. There was a merger with Long John Silver's in 1999. And then what really finished it off. In March of 2002, Tricon Global Restaurants paid $320 million for A&W Restaurants and Long John Silver's. On May 22, 2002, Tricon rebranded as Brands, parent company of KFC, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell. Before the acquisition even closed, 83 co-branded KFC and A&W locations were already operating. That told you where Yum was taking this. More locations moved into CO-branded formats in standard roadside strip malls. The classic drive-in setup, the canopies and speaker boxes and aluminum trays, did not fit the new model and was not going to survive it. The root beer experience changed next. Yum had a lifetime fountain contract with Pepsi. Under that arrangement, the drink service at A&W locations shifted. The A&W root beer brand itself was separately owned and eventually landed with Keurig Dr. Pepper, which distributed it in grocery stores and through international markets. So the name survived. You could find it on a shelf in the soda aisle. But that is a different thing from what A&W had always been. What longtime customers remembered, root beer served in-house and poured into a frozen glass right in front of you, was gone at most locations. In its place came a paper cup with a plastic lid, filled from the same kind of fountain machine you would find at any fast food counter on any interstate exit in the country. To customers who had been coming since the 1950s, it tasted like something they could get anywhere, because it was. At most locations, the frosty glass mugs disappeared too. The ones that had been sitting in a freezer until the moment they filled them, the ones generations of people had quietly slid under their seats at the end of the night. Gone. The carhops were long gone, the canopies torn down, the speaker boxes ripped out. You would walk into a KFC and A&W combo and order root beer, and they would fill a cup from the same fountain system they used for Pepsi. The whole point of A&W was that it was not like anywhere else. Yum Brands turned it into everywhere. Same-store sales declined year after year under Yum Brands' ownership. The franchisees who had built their lives around these restaurants watched the brand they had believed in get cheapened and shoved into a corner next to a bucket of fried chicken. Kevin Kline, who would later chair the National A&W Franchisee Association, watched it. Kevin Basner, who had been working inside A&W operations since 1985, watched it. If you grew up going to an A&W drive-in, if you remember the sound of roller skates on that parking lot and the weight of a frozen mug in your hand on a July night, you have every right to be angry about what happened to it. Someone made a decision. Someone signed a check for $320 million, and they handed you a paper cup and called it the same thing. Subscribe to the Silent Citadel, because this is what these stories actually are, not brands that faded on their own, but decisions made by named people on named days with named dollar amounts attached, and most of them were made at your expense. In 2011, Yum Brands put A&W up for sale. They did not want it anymore. KFC's China expansion was the priority. Thousands of new locations in a market that was growing every year. A&W was a distraction. So, they sold it. That is when the franchisees did something nobody expected. On December 19, 2011, a group called A Great American Brand LLC completed the purchase of A&W restaurants. The group was led by the National A&W Franchisee Association and A&W's largest international franchisee. For the first time in a long time, the people running the restaurants had a real say in how the company operated. Kevin Basner returned as chief executive officer the day the sale closed. They moved quickly. The company started shifting away from co-branding and building standalone drive-through restaurants again. They focused on what customers had been asking for all along. Same-store sales rose every year after the buyback. Average unit volumes climbed nearly 50% in the decade that followed. Around 70 new restaurants opened in the United States and Asia. The chain is still small, roughly 455 locations in the United States, mostly in Wisconsin, Michigan, California, and Minnesota. Some locations still have carhop service, someone actually walking out and hooking a tray on your car window. Canada makes the comparison hard to ignore. A&W. Canada had been sold off as a completely separate business years earlier and had been running independently ever since. Today, A&W Canada ranks as the country's second largest burger chain behind McDonald's. The same brand, under different ownership, running one of the most successful fast food operations in the country. The food was never the problem. The ownership was. If you know someone who remembers A&W, share this with them. Most people who lived through this never knew what actually happened or who was responsible. Now they can. 8 different owners, over 50 years. And in that time, someone decided the carhops cost too much. Someone decided the frosty mugs were inconvenient. Someone decided the concentrate was not worth it. Someone decided a paper cup was close enough. It was not. It was never close enough. And a lot of people who knew that, people who had run their A&W stands for decades, built their whole lives around that orange and brown sign, eventually got to prove it. They bought the company back, and every single year after, the numbers went up. The franchisees understood what 8 different corporate owners could not figure out in 50 years. What you remember from the backseat of your dad's car on a summer night, frost on the glass, the sound of roller skates on the pavement, the aluminum tray hooked right onto the window, that was not just a meal. That was the whole point, and someone took it from you, on purpose, for a strip mall and a paper cup. Not because the product ever stopped working, not because America stopped wanting it, because the people who owned it were never really paying attention to what they had. Next week, we are going back inside another American institution, one that had the formula right for decades, one that had the customers, the brand recognition, and the goodwill of an entire generation of Americans who grew up in its parking lots, and then let the wrong people run the numbers. Subscribe so you do not miss it.